This is another Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book personal story from the 1939 first edition of the Big Book. As you can see from the title there on the screen, it was originally called Traveler, Editor, Scholar, but then it later got revised to be called The News Hawk. It's written by Jim Scott from Akron, Ohio. The annual post-game banquet was winding up. The last rolling R of the speaker's hearty Caledonian accent died away sonorously. The company of students and alumni, all Scots, began to adjourn to the spacious bar for stronger stuff than the comparatively innocuous wines on the table. A goal scorer in a soccer game between my school and its centuries-old rival, I rated some popularity and the admiration of the moment expressed in famous aisles and whiskey and soda. I was the son of a clergyman and just past 16 years of age. Walking in my hotel room the next day, I groaned. I didn't want to see or talk to anyone. Then someone raised my hand and put a glass to my lips. What you need is a hair of the dog that bit you. Get this into you. The smell of this stuff sickened me. I grimaced. I gulped the draft down and fell back on the bed. Somehow it stayed down, and in about 15 minutes I began to feel better and managed to eat a fair breakfast. That was my first experience of the morning after drink. Back to college and my apprenticeship to a well-known lawyer, the students in their various clubs and societies tippled enormously. I gave up the law but stayed in school to graduate. Through these college years in a city of well over 1 million inhabitants, I learned all the better bar rooms. Burns and Byron and other colorful profligates were the literary idols in the gang of bloods with whom I was a popular figure. I thought I was a gay dog, and this was the life. With nothing but a liberal arts education, very definitely estranged from my family and already married, soon after graduation, I became a bookmaker's clerk on the British racing circuits. Far better off financially than the average professional man, I moved in a gay crowd in the various pubs and sporting clubs. My wife traveled with me, but with a baby coming, I decided to settle in a large city where I got a job with a commission agent, which is a polite term for a handbook operator. My job was to collect bets and betting slips in the business section, a lucrative spot. My boss, in his way, was a big business. Drinking was all in the day's work. One evening, the book, after the checking up, was very definitely in the red for plenty through a piece of studied carelessness on my part, and my boss, very shrewd and able, fired me with a parting statement to the effect that once was enough. With a good stake, I sailed from New York. I knew I was through among the English bookies. Tom Sharkey's brawling bar on 14th Street and the famous wine room at the back were headquarters for me. I soon ran through my stake. Some college friends got me jobs when I finally had to go to work, but I didn't stick to them. I wanted to travel. Making my way to Pittsburgh, I met other former friends who got a job in a large factory where peacemakers were making good money. My fellow workers were mostly good Saturday night drinkers, and I was right with them. Young and able to travel with the best of them, I managed to hold my job and keep my end up of the bar rooms. One of my keenest memories is of meeting Jack London, who came in unannounced one night to our favorite saloon, made a rousing speech, and later set up the drinks all evening. He wrote, I think, The Call of the Wild. Jack London, well-known author. I quit the factory and got a job on a small newspaper, going from that to a Pittsburgh daily, long ago defunct. Following a big drunk on that sheet where I was doing legwork and rewrite, a feeling of nostalgia made me buy a ticket for Liverpool, and I returned to Britain. During my visit there, renewing acquaintance with former friends, I soon spent most of my money. I wanted to roam again, and through relatives got a supercargo job on an Australian packet, which allowed me to visit my people in Australia where I was born. But I didn't stay long. I was soon back in Liverpool. Coming out of a pub near the Cunard Pier, I saw the Lusitania standing out in the middle of the Mersey. She had just come in and was scheduled to sail in 2 days. In my mind's eye, I saw Broadway again and Tom Sharkey's bar. The roar of the subway was in my ears. Saying goodbye to my wife and baby, I was treading Manhattan streets a little more than in a week. Again, I spent my bankroll, by no means as thick as the one I had had when I first saw the skyline of Gotham. I was soon broke, this time without train fare to go anywhere. I got my first introduction to riding the rods and making a blind. In my early 20s, the hardships of hobo life had not discouraged me, but I had no wish to become just a tramp. Forced to detrain with my empty gondola on the other side of Chicago by a terrific rainstorm which drenched me to the skin, I hit the first factory building I saw for a job. That job began a series of brief working spells, each one ending in a drunk and the urge to travel. My migrations extended for over a year as far west as Omaha, drifting back to Ohio. I landed on a small newspaper and later was impressed to the direction of boy welfare work at the local Y. I stayed sober for 4 years, except for a one-night carousal in Chicago. It's a pretty good time to stay sober. I stayed so sober that I used to keep a quart of medicinal whiskey in my bureau, which I used to taper off the occasional newspaper alcoholics who were sent to see me. Lots of times, vaingloriously, I used to take the bottle out, look at it, and say, "I've got you licked." The war was getting along, curious about it, feeling I was missing something, absolutely without any illusions about the aftermath. With no pronounced feeling of patriotism, I joined up with a Canadian regiment. Serving a little over 2 years, slight casualties, complicated, however, by a long and serious illness, were my only mishaps. Remarkably enough, I was a very abstemious soldier. My 4 years of abstinence had something to do with it, but soldiering is a tough enough game for a sober man, and I had no yen for a full pack slogging through mud with cognac and a Vin Rouge hangover. Discharged in 1919, I really made up for my dry spell. Quebec, Toronto, Buffalo, and finally Pittsburgh were the scenes of man-sized drunks until I had gone through my readjusted discharge pay, a fair sum. I again became a reporter on a Pittsburgh daily. I applied for a publicity job and got it. My wife came over from Scotland, and we started housekeeping in a large Ohio city. The new job lasted 5 years. Every encouragement was given to me with frequent salary increases, but the sober times between periods became shorter. I myself could see deterioration in my work, from being physically and mentally affected by liquor, although I not yet reached the point where all I wanted was more to drink. Successive Monday morning hangovers, which despite midweek resolutions to do better, came with unfailing regularity, eventually causing me to quit my job. Washington, D.C. and news gathering agency work followed with many parties. I couldn't stand the pace. My drinking was never the spaced doses of the careful tippler. It was always gluttonous. I understand that. Always gluttonous. Returning to the town I had left 3 months before, I became editor of a monthly magazine. Soon had additional publicity and advertising accounts, and the money rolled in. The strain of overwork soon led me to the bottle again. My wife made several attempts to get me to stop, and I had the usual visits from persons who would always ask me who, as if I knew, offered the job of advertising manager for an Eastern automotive company. I moved to Philadelphia to begin life anew. In 3 months, John Barleycorn had me kicked out. I did 6 years of newspaper advertising and trade journal work with many, many drunks of drab and dreary hue woven into the pattern of my life. I visited my family just once in that time. an old avocation, a collection of first editions, rare books, and Americana fascinated me between times. I had some financial success through no ability of my own, and when jobless and when almost jobless and when jobless and almost wiped out in 1930, I began to trade and sell my collection, and much of the proceeds went to keep my apartment stocked with liquor, and almost every night saw me helpless to bed. Isn't that something? I tried to help myself. I even began to go the rounds of the churches. I listened to famous ministers. I found nothing. I began to know the inside of jails and workhouses. My family would have nothing to do with me, in fact, couldn't, because I couldn't spare any of the money which I needed to drink to support them. My last venture, a bookshop, was hastened to close down by my steady intoxication. Then I had an idea. Loading a car with good old books to sell to collectors, librarians, and universities and historical societies, I started out to travel the country. I stayed sober during the trip, except for an occasional bottle of beer, because funds barely covered expenses. When I hit Houston, Texas, I found employment in a large bookstore. Need I say that in a very short time, I was walking along a prairie highway with arm extended and thumb pointed. In the 2 succeeding years, I held 10 different jobs, ranging from newspaper copy desk and rewrite to traffic director for an oil field equipment company. Always in between, there were intervals of being broke, riding freights, and hitchhiking interminable distances from one big town to another in 3 states. Now, on a new job, I was always thinking about payday and how much liquor I could buy and the pleasure I could have. I can relate. I knew I was a drunkard. Enduring all the hangover hells that every alcoholic experiences, I made the usual resolutions. My thoughts sometimes turned to the idea that there must be a remedy. I've stood listening to street corner preachers tell how they did beat the game. They seemed to be happy in their fashion. They and the little group of supporters, but always pride of intellect, stopped me from seeking what they evidently had. Sniffing at emotional religion, I walked away. I was an honest agnostic, but definitely not a hater of the church or its adherents. What philosophy had, I was thoroughly paganistic. All my life, I was devoted to a search for pleasure. Let's read that again. What philosophy I had was thoroughly paganistic. All my life was devoted to a search for pleasure. I wanted to do nothing except what it pleased me to do, and when I wanted to do it. Federal Theater in Texas gave me an administrative job, which I held for a year only because I worked hard and productively when I worked, and because my tolerant chief ascribed my frequent lapses to a bohemian temperament. When it was closed through Washington edict, I began with federal writers in San Antonio. In those days, my system was always to drink up my last paycheck and believe that necessity would bring the next job. A friend who knew I would soon be broke mounted guard over me when I left my job of writing the histories of Texas cities and put me aboard a bus for the town I had left almost 5 years before. In 5 years, a good many persons had forgotten that I had been somewhat notorious. I had arrived drunk, but promised my wife I would keep sober, and I knew I would get work if I did. Of course, I didn't keep sober. My wife and family stood by me for 10 weeks and then quite justifiably ejected me. I managed to maintain myself with odd jobs, did 10 weeks in a social rescue institution, and at length wound up in a secondhand bookstore in an adjacent town as manager. While there, I was called to the hospital in my hometown to see a former partner who insisted that I visit him. I found my friend was there for alcoholism, and now he was insisting that he had found the only cure. I listened to him. Rather reluctantly, I noticed a Bible on his table in amazement. I've never known him to be anything but a good, healthy pagan with a propensity for getting into liquor, jams, and scrapes. As I talked, I gathered vaguely because he was faltering. He was a faltering beginner then, just as I am now, then to be relieved of alcoholism. I'd have to be different. Some days later, after he'd been discharged, a stranger came into my shop in the nearby town. He introduced himself and began to tell me about a bunch of some 60 former drinkers and drunkards who met once a week, and he invited me to go with him to the next meeting. I thanked him, pleaded business engagements, and promised I'd go with him at some future time. Anyhow, I'm on the wagon now, he said. I said, I'm doing a job I like, and it's quite quiet where I live. Practically no temptations. I don't feel bothered about liquor. He looked at me quizzically. He knew too well that didn't mean a thing, just as I knew in my heart that it would be only a question of time, a few days, a week, or even a month. It was inevitable till I would be off on another bender. The time came just a week later, and as I look back on the events of 2 months, I can clearly see that I've been circling around, half afraid of encountering the remedy for my situation, half wanting it, deferring fulfillment of my promise to get in touch with the doctor I'd heard about. An accident while drunk laid me low for about 3 weeks. As soon as I could get up and walk, I started to drink again and kept it up until my friend of the hospital, who in the first try at the new way of life had stubbed his toe in Chicago but had come back to the town to take counsel and make a new start, picked me up and got me into hospital. I've been drinking heavily from one state of semi-coma to another, and it was several days before I got defogged and I subconsciously was earnest about wanting to quit liquor forever. It was no momentary emotionalism born of self-pity in a maudlin condition. I was seeking something, and I was ready to learn. I did not need to be told that my efforts I did not need to be told that my efforts were and would be unavailing if I did not get help. The doctor who came to see me almost at once did not assail me with any new doctrines. He made sure I had a need, and I wanted to have that need filled, and little by little, I learned how my need could be met. The story of Alcoholics Anonymous fascinated me. Singly and in groups of 2 or 3, they came to visit me. Some of them I had known for years, good two-fisted drinkers who disappeared from their former haunts. I'd missed them myself from the bar rooms of the town. They were businessmen, professional men, factory workers. All sorts were represented in their relation of experiences and how they found the only remedy added to their human existence as sober men laid the foundation of a very necessary faith. Indeed, I was beginning to see that I would require implicit faith, like a small child, if I was going to get anywhere, or so it appeared as I lay in that hospital. The big thing was that these men were all sober and evidently had something I didn't have. Whatever it was, I wanted it. I left the hospital on a meeting night. I was greeted warmly, honestly, and with a true ring of sincerity by everyone present. That night I was taken home by a former alcoholic and his wife. They did not show me to my room and wish me a good night's rest. Instead, over coffee cups, this man and his wife told me what had been done for them. They were earnest and obviously trying to help me on the road I'd chosen. They will never know how much their talk with me has helped. The hospitality of their home and their fine fellowship were mine freely. I had never, since the believing days of childhood, been able to conceive an authority directing the universe. But I had never been a flippant, wisecracking sneerer at the few persons I had met who impressed me as Christian men and women, or at any institution whose sincerity of purpose I could see. No conviction was necessary to establish my status as a miserable failure at managing my own life. I began to read the Bible daily and to go over a simple devotional exercise as a way to begin each day. Gradually, I began to understand. I cannot say that my taste for liquor has entirely disappeared. It's been that way with some, but it has not been that way with me and may never be. Neither can I honestly say that I have ever gotten the flesh pots of Egypt. I haven't. Flesh pots of Egypt. Not sure what that is. Old reference, I guess. But I can remember the urge of the prodigal son to return to his father, that he might taste of the husks that the swine did eat. Formerly, in the acute mental and physical pain during the remorseful periods succeeding each drunk, I found my recollection of the misery I had gone through a bolsterer of resolution, and afterwards, perhaps, a deterrent for a time. But in those days, I had no one to whom I might take my troubles. Today I have. Today I have someone who will always hear me. I have a warm fellowship among men who understand my problems. I have tasks to do and am glad to do them, to see others who are alcoholics and to help them in any way I can to become sober men. I took my last drink in 1937. Join me in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and forever. Amen.